and welcome to today's webinar on storytelling for business. It's about crafting compelling narratives, compelling stories. Now, with public speaking, many people focus on content. They've got a lot of data, a lot of information. They're clear of their core messages. And if you want to be impactful, if you want to be memorable, I would always encourage you to weave a story, a business story, through that presentation, through that public speaking. So today's webinar is about storytelling from a business perspective and how to make it more compelling. So Peter Dew's my name, public speaking trainer and coach, and I'm hoping at the end of this webinar, you've got a few ideas that you might use the next time you're crafting a presentation and how you can weave a story in. Storytelling for business, crafting a compelling narrative. So storytelling is an important component within public speaking, and it's one of those things that will determine whether your message resonates, has impact, or fades away, and people in 3 months' time have little memory of what was said in your presentation. I'm just going to change my screen. All right. Those of you who've done my webinars before, you'll understand that ask questions as we go, put in your own comments. I've got the chat box open. Any questions, any comments, please put them in. Feel free to take notes. And importantly, think about what you might do differently. Got a presentation coming up? Are you going to weave in a story? Are you going to fine tune that story? What are you going to use from today that'll take your next presentation to the next level? That's what this webinar is about, helping you move forward. So first things first, why do we tell stories? And it's important that we create our own stories. So why do we tell stories? Well, the first thing is it helps us to advocate for other people. And I do a lot of work with people within the disability field, and they don't necessarily always have the ability to advocate fully for themselves. And often they need a spokesperson, a champion to advocate on behalf of them, to educate people, to provide new information. And we want people to understand this is the new way of doing business. This is the new policy. This is the new safety standard. To influence people, so we might be in change management. We're going to do things a different way, and people are going to say, not another change, resistance. So our ability to influence through good storytelling can move people to a different way of thinking. Promote new thinking, to create change, all related to being able to be influenced and to create more memorable messages. There's the memorable message that sticks, and there's that message that fades away and nobody remembers it. Storytelling helps us to be memorable, to be influential, to educate, to persuade people. That's why we tell stories. Further evidence around the importance of storytelling comes from Stanford University, and they followed a whole group of, a whole cohort of students and watched what their lecturers did and measured the retention rate of information. And what they found was if the lecturer just spoke to them, so told them lots of facts, told them information, 1 in 10 of the students would remember what was said later on. If they put up PowerPoint slides, you've got the PowerPoint slide there. I do a handout, so I give you a handout sheet, or I go to a whiteboard and I write something on the whiteboard. So I create some visual aids to help complement the words I'm saying, then I've tripled the retention rate to 30%. So now 3 out of 10 students remember what I've said, remember what you've said. The flip side, 7 out of 10 participants in your workshop, 7 out of 10 attendees at your conference don't remember what you've said. If you throw in a story that creates an emotional, a visceral response, then you're increasing your retention rate to 70, 75%. That is why we tell stories. And one of the sayings we have in professional speaking is people do not remember what you have said. They remember how you make them feel. So your role is to create that visceral emotional response so people can say, aha, we've got this. I can see light at the end of the tunnel. I can see a way through this trauma, this labyrinth of problems that I'm facing. I can see a way forward now because you've moved me emotionally with your story. That is why we tell stories. And the third reason to tell stories is they're your unique intellectual property. When you share a story of your success, of your failure, of your near miss, of your struggle, of your overcoming adversity, and people say, well, no, that won't work. That doesn't seem right. You can say, well, let me tell you a little bit more about exactly what happened. So it's your unique intellectual property. And it also sort of specializes, positions you as a specialist in that area if you're telling the story of your experience about which you're also training people in or presenting in from an intellectual perspective, from a practical perspective. The story underlying it makes such a big difference. All right, the business story. With stories, some people get confused, bedtime stories, motivational stories, funny stories. If you're an entertainer, you might tell funny stories. If you're a comedian, you might use stories purely for humor. Humor's okay in public speaking, but I'm talking about the business story. And I work a lot with engineers, with accountants, and other professional people that are very scientific driven, very analytical driven. And they feel that when they put forward data, numbers, return on investment, that should be sufficient to persuade people or influence people to go another way. The reality is that you cannot do this. You cannot just give data because people do not remember data. They remember how you make them feel. So this is the business story. And the engineers worry a little bit about this. Why would I tell stories? So the first thing is you do need data. So this is good news for engineers, for accountants. I'm not saying throw your data out and just tell stories. The examples, the case studies, the research you've done, the break-even number, the return on investment, the facts and the figures, the risk reward ratio, give this information by all means. This appeals to our head. Aha. This is the logical part of our thinking. Coupled with that, tell the story. So this is the personal story. This is the overcoming adversity. This is your vulnerability. This is the story that has a purpose and links to the data or the information you've just spoken about. This is your struggle. This is the finding a way forward, helping a group move forward, regardless of issues, challenges that they face. And the stories appeal to our heart. They create an emotional, a visceral response down here in our gut. When you put these two things together, the data and the story. The data appeals to the head and the story appeals to the heart or the gut. And we always say head first, heart second. So if you just dive into storytelling without a little bit of preface about the point or the reason you're telling the story, then you may just be seen as a storyteller. And that's great for an entertainer. That's great for stand-up comedians. And I love this quote from Brene Brown. Maybe stories are just data with soul. So the business story, head first, heart second. Data, numbers, return on investment, and then followed by, so what does that look like? What does that feel like? Give me an example in action. One of the things that I say is that nerves are a normal part of public speaking. Psychologists call it fight or flight. And fight or flight puts you in that peak performance mode. Fight or flight makes your peripheral vision pop. Fight or flight makes you responsive, sharp, alert. So nerves and public speaking do go hand in hand. So there's the data for you. Now I need to bring in a story. Some of you will have heard of Sally Pearson. She was an Olympic gold medalist, 2012 London Olympics. She was interviewed before the gold medal race, the final. She's come through the heats, won, next heat won. Now she's in the final. And she was interviewed, how are you feeling? She said, I'm nervous. I'm really nervous. This is the Olympic Games. But I'm glad that I've got nerves. If I didn't have nerves, I wouldn't be ready to race. If Sally Pearson didn't have nerves, she would not be ready to race. And she won the gold medal. And she was aware that that nervous energy, that fight or flight, put her in that peak performance mode that she needed to win a gold medal race. So when you're public speaking and you're a little bit nervous, understand that those nerves help your peripheral vision pop. They help you be a little bit more responsive. So there's a story that underpins the data or the business point I was making around nerves are a normal part of any performance, whether it's acting, whether it's athletics, whether it's public speaking. So here's a model for rolling out the story. What I would do is I would make a point first. So the point is nerves are a normal part of public speaking. They call it fight or flight. Psychologists understand that fight or flight puts you in peak performance mode. There's another one, by the way, called freeze. Freeze is when you freeze. And I don't want anyone to freeze on stage, but I do want you to be in your peak performance mode. Tell a story, Sally Pearson. Reiterate the point. So nerves are an important point in peak performance. Sally Pearson understood that. The most important part of this storytelling model is highlight the benefit to you. If I make a point and I tell a story and I reiterate the point and you don't care, I've got the wrong story for the wrong audience. So public speaking is a normal part of peak performance. Public speaking is a normal part. Nerves are a normal part of public speaking. Anxiety, performance, nerves are a normal part of any performance. So my point is, don't wait to get rid of nerves. Don't feel that nerves are necessarily bad as you walk on stage. Sally Pearson, tell the story. So remember, when you get a little bit nervous, this is about you. When you get a little bit nervous before you walk on stage, remember it's okay to have nerves. These nerves can be harnessed and they put you in your peak performance mode. That is of value to you. So let's go through that again. Make your point. This is your business point. Tell the story that you have, your unique story that develops and underlines and illustrates the point. Reiterate the point and then outline the benefit to the people in the room, the people listening to you. why this matters to them, and that's the art and the model of the business story. Where do your stories come from? They come from everywhere in life and in work. And I mean in life. So something that happens to you, something you observe, good customer service, bad customer service, you can bring into your work. The message is the same. So those mistakes you make, the people you meet and their successes and their struggles, the problems that you solve, both at work and outside of work and within your own life, those unexpected events, those surprises that occur to you and how you dealt with them. Everyday life. And here's an important thing: the best stories come from the heart and experience rather than the head. So don't think about you have to write, what story can I think of? What story can I create to illustrate my point? I would rather you recognize an experience and think, wow, there's a wonderful lesson in that story, and capture that story and give it a name. Write it down. My story about Sally Pearson is Sally Pearson. So stories come from everywhere. A few other tips for storytelling: have a signature story, that story that you're kind of known for, that unique experience that most people have not been involved in. My unique story, my signature story, is that I'm a person who stutters, and I've overcome my stutter largely to now have a successful public speaking, conference speaking business. So I speak for a living, and I'm a person who stutters and for most of their life avoided stuttering. How did I get from stuttering and not speaking to speaking for a living? That's my signature story. Another tip: recent stories beat the old stories. So these are the stories. So it was 1975. I was in high school, and yeah, it's always try and come up with a more recent story. So last week I was in Karratha. That recency of story has higher impact than the story that happened a long time ago. Your signature story is an exception to that. Grace Tame, Australian of the Year, as a 20-year-old. Her signature story, why she became Australian of the Year, was to do with um, her brilliant advocacy, a brilliant changing of government around sexual abuse of children in high school. She herself was groomed by a school teacher, sexually abused. He went to prison. She wasn't allowed to talk about it under Tasmanian law. She fought and changed the law, and then gradually changed society in Australia, conversations, and became Australian of the Year. That signature story, that doesn't go away. Even though as Grace Tame moves on and gets older, and that story becomes older, that signature story remains. What I'm saying is those stories you pick up everywhere to add to your messages, recent stories are better than old stories. Here's another tip: if it doesn't add to the story, then it detracts from the story. I see people go into storytelling and they give too much detail. It was in April 1984. Hang on, might have been May 1984. In fact, yes, I'm positive it was May 1984 that I was, no one cares whether it was April or May 1984. And even 1984 is not necessarily important unless it has an impactful part of your story. Several years ago, I found myself, is better than, it was April 1984. I found myself, hang on just a moment, might have been May 1984. I found myself in a situation where it doesn't really matter. I found myself, in the past, I found myself in a situation So if the detail doesn't add to the story, take it out. And where possible, relive the story rather than just retell the story. So Grace Tame was able to have that emotional connection with her story that also connected with the audience. So rather than retell the story, facts, chronological date, step by step, go through the story, try and transport yourself back emotionally to the feeling you had when you experienced that story. And one of my stories is when my boss told me that I'd never be successful in my career because of my stutter. And he said, just go back, to the lab, stop hassling. You'll never be a senior scientist. You'll never be a lab manager. And you should be grateful you've got a job. Now, I remember that day fresh in my mind. And when I retell that story, I don't just go through the data. I emotionally I can still visualize it in my head. I mean, you walk out of there, your career aspirations, your goals, absolutely shattered. And you need to sort of relive that without tipping too far into an emotional sort of wreck. One of the things we also say is don't do therapy on stage. So don't, do a debrief, reveal a terrible trauma to yourself that triggers you or maybe triggers someone in the audience. So be careful with your stories, but where possible, relive them rather than retell them, chronologically word for word. So some common mistakes: not using your own personal stories. So I borrowed a story from Sally Pearson. So that is not my own story. I use that story to illustrate the point about fight or flight. It would be far better to use my own story, not letting the audience know in advance. So the model is make your point. Let me share a story with you now that illustrates that point, as opposed to make a point and then just spontaneously go into a story and people say, hey, what's going on here? Using the wrong story for the wrong audience. So sometimes you need to frame the story or work out what story best matches that audience. If I'm working with engineers, geologists, mining sector, the stories and the information that's going to influence them is different to when I'm working with nurses, social workers, mental health practitioners. They're going to want different sort of stories to match with them. So choosing the right story for your audience. Using old stories that are worn to death. Have you heard the story of the hare and the tortoise? And they had a race and the hare went off really quick and then he fell asleep. And then the tortoise just kept plodding and plodding and plodding and he passed the hare. Slow and steady wins the race. That's a really good fable, but it's really old. What else can you use more recent to illustrate that slow and steady persistence, perseverance will get you there in the end? Don't make yourself the hero of the story. I need to be careful in my own journey as a person who stutters. When I tell my story, people think, oh, you're amazing, Peter. Well done, Peter. That is not the purpose of that story. And I always turn it back. So the good news with my story is that public speaking is a skill, which means each and every one of you, regardless of where you are now, can move forward and become as good a public speaker as you want, as great a public speaker as you need to be. Public speaking is a skill. I'm here not through natural skills. I'm not here through natural ability. I'm here through doing the work that you need to do as you move forward. So try not to make yourself the hero of the story. I use a metaphor, the mirror. If you say too many, I did this, me, I, the mirror is on yourself. I'm really good. I've got an MBA. I've been doing this for 16 years. I've trained over 250,000 people in public speaking. That's nice, Peter. Put the mirror on your audience. So if you're struggling with your public speaking, you can learn to get the skills that you need. You can get some coaching. You can find yourself a textbook. You can join a Toastmasters club. What you've got to say matters. So never let fear, self-doubt, imposter syndrome be the reason you don't speak up. The mirror is on my audience. And the last thing to avoid, mistake, having to explain or interpret the story. So what I mean by that story is, and then you've got to go into detail, the story needs to be self-explanatory. You know the same saying with jokes. If you have to explain the meaning of a joke, then the joke is not funny. If you have to explain the meaning or interpret the story, then the story's probably not the right story. So let's end with a quote from Seth Godin. The marketer's job then is to tell a true story, one that resonates, one that matters to people, and to repeat it often enough that it creates value to your audience. That's Seth Godin, the marketing guru. So what have we got in summary? Why tell stories? We need to advocate for people. We need to persuade people. Why tell stories? People don't remember what you've said. They remember what you've said. They don't remember what you've said. They remember how you make them feel. That's why we tell stories. If you talk to people, 1 in 10 remembers. If you show videos, PowerPoint, then 3 in 10 remember. If you tell a story that creates a visceral response, a heart response, then 70 to 75%, 7 out of 10 people will remember what you've said. The business story, head first, give the data, give the information, heart second, the overcoming adversity, the success despite all odds. A model for telling stories, make your point, tell the story that carries, illustrates, amplifies the point, reiterate the point, and most importantly, outline the benefit, put the mirror on your audience. This matters to you because stories come from everywhere. A few further tips around reliving your story. If it doesn't add to the story, it takes away from the story. And common mistakes, using old stories, having to explain the stories. Try and avoid those common mistakes. What have I got coming up? I've got some regional workshops in the Pilbara, March in Karratha, 3rd and 4th of April in Port Hedland. I have capacity to run workshops in Perth, probably going to Victoria, Bendigo, Melbourne at the end of May. So I'll have capacity once again to run in-house workshops. Next webinar coming up, mastering the Q&A session, the question and answer session. So how do you handle those audience questions with poise? This is the 18th of February. Sometimes you get those hecklers, those difficult questions, and your credibility, your success can come tumbling down if you don't answer your Q&A session well. You know how to reach me. It's been a pleasure spending this half hour with you. So remember, stories are a great tool that you can use in public speaking. Stories engage people. They become more memorable. They can create a visceral response. And people don't remember what you've said. They remember how you make them feel. And this is where the art of storytelling comes in to effective public speaking. This is Peter Dew, public speaking trainer and coach.